Have you ever been underestimated for something you thought was a strength, only to find yourself standing at the edge of a challenge where every doubt suddenly feels louder than your own voice? What if I told you that this story begins with laughter, not the warm, comforting laughter we all love, but the kind that cuts deep, the kind that comes from people who think they are better than you? Because in their eyes, Filipinos could never speak English the way they did. And that belief, cruel as it was, would set the stage for one of the most unforgettable turnarounds they had ever witnessed. It all started in a crowded university hall, not in Manila, but far away from home, in a prestigious international campus where students from all corners of the globe gathered. For many, English was not just a language, it was a currency of intelligence, a weapon to prove superiority. And in this hall, filled with students from Europe, America, and Asia, stood a small group of young Filipinos. They were confident, yes, but also aware of how easily their accents could be mocked, how quickly their words could be dismissed. One of them, let's call her Maria, had dreamed of this moment since childhood. Growing up in Davao, she had watched her father work late nights while still making sure she had books to read. He always told her, "Daughter, your voice is your weapon. Use it well." Maria carried that lesson with her like armor. But nothing could prepare her for what happened that day, moments before the debate began. As she and her teammates were setting their notes on the table, she overheard a group of foreign students chuckling. One tall boy, his accent heavy and sharp, sneered just loud enough for others to hear. "I wonder if they'll even understand the motion. Do they even know proper English?" His friends laughed, some covering their mouths, others smirking openly. It was a small remark, maybe forgettable in another context, but in that charged atmosphere it felt like a slap. Maria froze. Her teammates exchanged nervous glances. They had heard jokes like this before, on social media, in casual conversations, in whispered stereotypes that painted Filipinos as good workers. Yes, but never intellectual equals. This time, however, it wasn't just a comment. It was a direct challenge, thrown like a gauntlet at their feet, daring them to prove otherwise. Now here's the part that surprises most people. Instead of breaking down or walking away, Maria didn't respond. She didn't glare. She didn't fire back. She simply adjusted her papers, straightened her shoulders, and whispered to her team, "Let them laugh. We'll answer later." Her calmness was unexpected, almost unsettling. But inside, her heart was racing. She felt the heat rising to her cheeks, the sting of humiliation pressing into her chest. And yet, this is where the story begins to turn. Because sometimes it is in silence that the greatest strength is born. The audience filed in, professors and students filling every seat. The debate was not just any competition, it was a showcase, streamed live for the entire university community. Each word spoken would echo beyond those four walls. The motion was complex, tied to global economics and politics, a topic that required not just vocabulary, but depth of thought, clarity, and confidence. Maria's team sat waiting for their turn to speak, while the mocking group took the floor first. Their confidence was unshakable, their tone dripping with superiority. They strutted across the stage, throwing words like weapons, smirking each time the audience nodded. It was, in their minds, already won. But what they didn't realize was that every word of mockery earlier had lit a fire inside the Filipino team. For Maria, it wasn't just about winning a debate anymore. It was about dignity. It was about standing in front of the world and saying, "We are more than what you think we are." Have you ever felt that moment when your pride, your family, your entire nation feels like it is standing behind you? That's what Maria felt. She remembered her father's words. She remembered the long nights she had practiced in front of a mirror, the sacrifices her family made for her to study abroad, the countless times she stayed up reading books because she wanted to compete at the highest level. And now, here she was, her chance to turn humiliation into honor. The announcer called their team's name. Maria stood. Her teammates followed, carrying their notes, but also carrying the weight of every Filipino who had ever been mocked for their English. The room was silent, waiting. Maria walked to the podium. She could still hear the laughter in her mind, the way they had dismissed her before she even spoke. She placed her hand on the microphone, took a breath, and then something remarkable happened. She smiled. Not out of nervousness, but out of a quiet, rising confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, her accent clear. "They say language is power, but power does not come from where you are born, or the accent you carry. Power comes from how you use your words, and the truth you choose to speak." The hall stirred. People leaned in. Even the mockers stopped smiling. Something in her tone, in the quiet conviction of her first sentence, had caught them off guard. This was not the nervous, broken English they expected. This was something else entirely. And so the journey began. When Maria stepped away from the podium after her opening words, there was a pause in the air, the kind that feels like the room itself is holding its breath. But to truly understand the weight of that moment, we need to go back to the quiet beginnings that shaped her, to the small pieces of her life that most people would never see. Because the truth is, victories like this are never born on stage. They are born in the shadows of sacrifice, in the unnoticed struggles of everyday life. Maria grew up in a modest home in Davao City, where English was not spoken casually at the dinner table. It was learned, practiced, and often stumbled through with laughter. Her mother, a public school teacher, insisted that Maria read aloud from old books she had collected over the years. Sometimes the words were too big, sometimes Maria would mispronounce them, and her father, a jeepney driver, would chuckle softly. But then he would say something that never left her. "It's not about sounding like them. It's about being understood, about speaking with a heart that believes in what it says." That simple lesson carried her through her childhood. She became the girl who always raised her hand in class, even when her grammar wasn't perfect. She joined school contests, sometimes winning, sometimes losing, but always learning. By the time she was in high school, her teachers saw a spark in her, a voice that, though young, carried conviction. They encouraged her to join debate clubs, and that was where she first tasted both triumph and humiliation. You see, debating wasn't just about facts, it was about presence. And Maria, though intelligent, often found herself mocked by her peers who had more polished accents or came from wealthier families with better access to international schools. She remembered one boy telling her, "You'll never sound convincing if you sound provincial." It stung, but it didn't stop her. Instead, it carved something deeper inside her, a determination to prove that content would always matter more than style. By the time she earned a scholarship abroad, Maria thought she had grown used to the small jabs, the quiet underestimations. But she wasn't prepared for the scale of it in an international setting. The first time she introduced herself in class, a girl from Europe tilted her head and asked slowly, "Do you actually think in English?" The class laughed. Maria forced a smile, but inside she felt small again, like that little girl struggling over words at her mother's table. And yet, life has a way of teaching us in the most ordinary moments. One evening, while studying late in the campus library, Maria overheard two Filipino janitors speaking in English. Their sentences were broken, but their message was clear as they joked about their families, about life back home. Maria sat there, listening quietly, and realized something profound. Communication had never been about perfection. It had always been about connection. That realization became a quiet strength she carried forward. Her teammates had their own stories too. One of them, Joshua, came from Cebu and had grown up with English as part of his daily schooling, but he was often told his accent was too thick. Another, Anna, was shy, almost painfully so, but her written arguments were sharp and precise, the kind that could dismantle an opponent's point with a single sentence. Together they were not the polished, elite kind of team others expected to win, but they had something else. They had resilience. They had hunger. They had each other. As the debate competition drew near, the team spent nights practicing. They sat in small classrooms, sometimes arguing fiercely with each other, sometimes laughing until their stomachs hurt. Maria often stayed behind after the others left, standing alone in front of the mirror, rehearsing her lines. She would adjust her voice, slow her pace, and remind herself, it's not about sounding like them, it's about making them listen. But still, doubt lingered. There were moments when Maria questioned herself. Was she truly ready to face students who had grown up in English-speaking countries, whose confidence came effortlessly, whose words flowed like water? She remembered walking across campus one day and hearing a group of American students casually mocking accents from Asia. They weren't talking about her, but the sting felt the same. She wanted to scream, to tell them that language was more than accent, more than sound. It was identity, it was history. And yet, instead of screaming, she chose silence. She chose preparation. She chose to let her performance on stage answer what words in the hallway could not. The night before the debate, Maria couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the echoes of laughter in her mind. She thought about her father, still driving late shifts back home, probably worrying if she had eaten. She thought about her mother, who once told her that a voice used for truth could never be silenced. She whispered to herself in the dark, almost like a prayer, "Tomorrow I will speak for them too." When dawn broke, the team gathered early. The atmosphere was tense, but Maria noticed something different in her teammates. Joshua was unusually quiet. Anna kept fiddling with her notes, but there was also a kind of fire in their eyes. They weren't just going to compete, they were going to fight for respect. And that brings us back to the hall, the stage set, the audience waiting. The mocking group had already performed, their arrogance on full display. The professors nodded politely, the audience clapped, and it all seemed to confirm what everyone expected, that the polished accents would carry the day. But behind the curtains, Maria closed her eyes. She remembered her childhood table, the laughter, the lessons, the long nights of practice. She remembered the janitors in the library, the sacrifices of her parents, the sting of mockery that had followed her across borders. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. She was no longer just Maria from Davao. She was every Filipino who had ever been underestimated. And when the announcer called their names, they didn't walk onto that stage as students. They walked as a people. The room was alive with a quiet tension as Maria and her teammates took their seats on stage. From the outside, it might have looked like just another academic event, but to those who carried scars of mockery and doubt, it felt like stepping into an arena where their very worth was on trial. For Maria, the laughter she had heard earlier still echoed in her chest. Yet instead of breaking her, it steadied her resolve. Joshua leaned closer and whispered, "We've got this. Just remember what we practiced." Anna nodded nervously, clutching her papers like a lifeline. Maria gave them both a small smile, even though her own palms were damp with sweat. The moderator announced the motion, a complex economic question about whether smaller nations could outmaneuver global superpowers in trade negotiations. It wasn't an easy topic, and the mockers from earlier had chosen it specifically to show off their mastery of jargon and their ability to dominate with polished rhetoric. Their delivery had been loud, confident, almost theatrical. Now it was the Filipinos' turn. Joshua spoke first. His voice carried a slight tremor at the start, but as he outlined their framework, something remarkable happened. The audience leaned in. His accent was still there, but his logic was razor-sharp. He broke down the motion into simple, digestible pieces that cut through the noise of jargon. When he finished, a few students in the audience actually nodded. Maria caught the sight and felt her chest swell. Then came Anna. She was soft-spoken, and at first some doubters in the crowd shifted in their seats, expecting little from her. But when she launched into her points, dismantling one of the opposing team's arguments with cold precision, the room changed. She used facts like a scalpel, quiet, but devastating. A hush fell over the hall. For the first time, the arrogance of their opponents cracked. And then it was Maria's turn. She stood slowly, walking to the podium as if she had done it 100 times before. But inside, every heartbeat was a drum. She placed her papers down, but she didn't look at them. She looked directly at the audience, and then at the opponents who had laughed earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice calm yet filled with conviction, "we have heard many words today, big words, fancy words. But sometimes the truth is not in the size of the words. It is in their clarity." The audience stirred again. Some professors exchanged glances. Maria pressed forward. She used examples from Philippine history, weaving in stories of resilience, of how her people had survived colonization and stood strong despite centuries of being underestimated. She spoke of global economics, yes, but she framed it through the lens of lived experience, through the perspective of nations that had learned to adapt, innovate, and survive despite lacking size or power. Her English wasn't perfect in the sense of mimicry. Her accent remained, her rhythm distinctly Filipino. But it carried something more powerful than polished diction. It carried sincerity. It carried truth. The mockers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them rolled his eyes, but the audience was no longer with them. The tide was turning. And then came the moment that silenced the hall. Maria leaned slightly forward and said, "When you mocked us earlier for how we speak, you revealed something important. You revealed that you believe language is a measure of intelligence. But what you fail to see is this. Language is a bridge. And bridges are not judged by their decoration, but by whether they carry people across." A ripple went through the crowd. Some gasped. Others clapped softly before stopping, aware that applause wasn't usually allowed mid-speech. But it was too late. The words had landed like a stone thrown into still water, sending waves in every direction. Maria continued, her voice steadier now. "We speak English not because we want to sound like anyone else, but because we want to connect. And today, if you understand my words, then I have succeeded. That is the true measure of language, not perfection, but connection." For a second, it seemed as if time froze. Maria's teammates stared at her in awe, The professors scribbled notes furiously. The opponents looked stunned, their earlier arrogance replaced with something unfamiliar, uncertainty. When Maria sat down, her hands trembled. Joshua squeezed her shoulder. Anna leaned in and whispered, "That was incredible." Maria only nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The debate continued, but the momentum had shifted. Every point the opposing team made now seemed hollow, their polished delivery suddenly feeling like empty theater compared to the authenticity they had just witnessed. By the time the final rebuttals came, the energy in the room had transformed completely. The laughter that had once cut like a knife was gone. In its place was a quiet respect. Still, the competition wasn't over. Maria knew that debates weren't judged on emotion alone. They were judged on content, structure, and logic. As the final statements ended, a heavy silence filled the room. The judges left briefly to deliberate. Maria's team sat together, not daring to hope too much, but feeling deep down that something extraordinary had just happened. Have you ever felt that moment, sitting in uncertainty, when you know regardless of outcome, you have already won something far greater? That was the feeling that wrapped around Maria. Even if the judges didn't see it, the audience had. The mockers had been silenced not by anger, but by truth. And then the judges returned. The hall quieted, every ear straining to hear the results. The head judge cleared his throat. He spoke slowly, carefully, outlining the strengths and weaknesses of both teams. For a moment, it felt as if the verdict could go either way. Maria's heart pounded so hard she thought it might echo in the microphone. Finally, the words came. The winners of today's debate. The judge paused, looking out over the hall, are the team from the Philippines. The room erupted. Applause thundered, filling every corner. Maria and her teammates froze, stunned, before embracing each other in disbelief and joy. For the first time, they weren't just participants. They were champions. And the ones who had laughed? They sat in silence, their smirks erased, forced to confront a truth they had never considered, that respect cannot be mocked away and dignity cannot be silenced. But what came after? The aftermath, the reactions, the quiet transformations would be just as unforgettable. The announcement of victory did not just end the debate. It began something larger. The applause echoed across the hall like a storm. Not the polite kind of clapping that fills the silence, but the kind that bursts out because people cannot hold it back. Maria stood frozen, her hands covering her mouth, tears threatening to spill as her teammates clung to her shoulders. Joshua laughed out loud in disbelief. Anna wiped her eyes, and for a moment they all looked less like competitors and more like children who had just been handed the most unexpected gift. But it was not the trophy or the title that mattered most. It was the faces in the crowd. Professors who had watched countless debates leaned forward, their expressions softened with admiration. Students who had dismissed them earlier now sat in silence, their preconceived notions crumbling. Even the opponents, the ones who had mocked their English, could not hide their shock. One of them stared down at his notes, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Another looked at Maria directly, his smirk gone, replaced by something that looked almost like respect. Grudging, but real. The judges stepped forward to explain their decision. One of them, a gray-haired professor known for his strict standards, spoke with unusual warmth. Today, we did not just hear arguments, we heard clarity, we heard conviction. And we were reminded that communication is not about perfection, but about truth. He paused, then added something that made Maria's throat tighten. I hope all of us leave here humbled, remembering that intelligence is never measured by accent. The hall fell into a reverent silence. It was the kind of statement that could linger long after the event ended. After the official announcements, students crowded around Maria's team. Some congratulated them, others asked questions, and a few even apologized. A girl from Europe who had once teased Maria about her accent came forward shyly and said, "I was wrong about you. You were powerful." Maria smiled gently, choosing not to remind her of the pain her earlier words had caused. Instead, she simply replied, "Thank you." That means a lot. In the corner of the hall, the mocking group packed their things quickly. They had lost more than a debate. They had lost the narrative they had built for themselves, the illusion of superiority. One of them muttered under his breath, "We underestimated them." Maria overheard it, and for the first time she did not feel anger. She felt something different. Pity. Because while they had tried to diminish her with laughter, they had been diminished by their own arrogance. Later that evening, when the crowd had dispersed, Maria and her teammates sat together on the steps outside the hall. The air was cool, and the city lights glimmered in the distance. They held the small trophy between them, but none of them seemed to care about its shine. What they cared about was what it symbolized. Anna spoke first, her voice trembling. "Do you realize what we did today? We didn't just win. We changed the way they see us." Joshua nodded, his usual humor replaced with sincerity. For once they couldn't laugh. For once, they had to listen. Maria looked at her friends, her chest heavy with emotion. She thought of her parents back home, of the janitors in the library, of every Filipino who had ever been told they were less because of how they spoke. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "This wasn't just for us. This was for everyone who has ever been mocked." And in that quiet moment, they all understood. But the story didn't end on those steps. In the days that followed, the debate spread across campus. Videos of Maria's speech circulated online, replayed and shared by students who couldn't stop talking about it. Comments poured in, some praising her eloquence, others admitting they had never considered the idea that language was more about connection than perfection. A few even confessed shame for the way they had laughed before. Maria walked across campus one afternoon and noticed something strange. People looked at her differently now. Not with mockery, not with doubt, but with recognition. Professors stopped her in hallways to commend her. Students approached her with questions about debate strategies. Even the girl who had once asked if she thought in English now listened intently when Maria spoke, her arrogance replaced with genuine curiosity. Yet through it all, Maria remained grounded. She knew this victory was not hers alone. It belonged to her team, to her family, to her country. When she called her parents to share the news, her mother cried softly on the phone, her father's voice thick with pride as he said, "I told you, Anak, your voice is your weapon." And today, you used it well. Maria wept too, not just from joy but from relief. All the sleepless nights, the doubts, the humiliations, they had all led to this. And while the world now saw her as a champion, she knew the real victory was something deeper. She had proved to herself that her voice mattered. But the true climax came a week later, when the university organized a small symposium on language and communication. To Maria's surprise, she was invited as one of the speakers. Standing on that stage again, but this time not as a competitor, she felt the weight of the journey she had taken. She told the audience, "We must stop equating accent with intelligence. Every language carries a story. Every accent carries history. When you mock someone's voice, you mock their story. But when you listen, you honor it. The audience erupted in applause once more. This time not because she had won a debate, but because her words had struck a chord that transcended competition. And somewhere in that crowd, Maria noticed the same tall boy who had laughed at her before. He didn't laugh now. He sat quietly, his head bowed, clapping slowly, his arrogance gone. In that moment, Maria realized something profound. Sometimes the greatest victories are not in defeating your enemies, but in changing them. The debate had ended, but the story was still unfolding. And what Maria carried forward from that moment was not just pride, it was responsibility. The weeks after the debate felt like a dream. Maria had walked into that hall carrying the weight of mockery, and she had walked out carrying a message that seemed to echo far beyond the walls of the university. But what truly mattered was not the applause, the trophy, or even the sudden respect from those who once laughed at her. What mattered was the quiet transformation that unfolded inside her, and in the hearts of those who listened. Back in her dormitory, Maria sometimes replayed the moment in her mind, the laughter, the sting, the trembling before she spoke, and then the silence that followed her words. She realized now that what had happened was bigger than her own pride. It was about something far more universal, the dignity of a people who had been underestimated for too long. One night, as she sat by her window watching the city lights, Maria opened her phone and saw messages from strangers. Filipinos she had never met had found the video online. Some were overseas workers who said, "You made us proud. We are always laughed at for our English, but you showed them." Others were students back home who admitted, "I was scared to speak up in class because of my accent. After watching you, I want to try again." Maria's heart swelled as she read each message. She understood now that her victory was not just hers. It belonged to every Filipino who had ever been mocked for their voice. It belonged to every worker abroad who struggled to explain themselves in English, but did it anyway, because they had to. It belonged to every child who read aloud in class, stumbling over words but daring to continue. And yet, even with this recognition, Maria remained humble. When a friend asked her how it felt to humble those who mocked her, she shook her head. "It was never about humbling them," she said softly. "It was about reminding them, and myself, that our worth is not measured by the sound of our words, but by the truth inside them." The symposium where she spoke about accents and intelligence became a turning point for the campus. Professors began weaving discussions about language and prejudice into their classes. Students started to listen more carefully to one another, realizing that brilliance often hides behind voices they once dismissed. Maria noticed that international students began to approach Filipino classmates differently, with a respect that hadn't been there before. But perhaps the most moving moment came one Sunday morning. Maria had been invited to a small Filipino community gathering at a nearby church. The group was made up mostly of overseas workers, nannies, nurses, caregivers, who came together every week for Mass and fellowship. When Maria entered, they recognized her immediately from the video. They applauded, not loudly, but with tears in their eyes. One elderly woman hugged her tightly and whispered, "You spoke for us, for all of us." In that embrace, Maria felt the weight of something sacred. She thought of how Filipinos had carried faith and resilience across oceans, how their voices had built homes, healed the sick, and taught children in countries far from their own. And yet, how often those same voices were mocked. She realized then that her role was not just to debate or to win trophies. Her role was to carry that dignity forward, to be a reminder that Filipino voices matter, always. Have you ever noticed how the most powerful moments in life are not when the world cheers, but when a single person tells you, "Because of you, I believe again"? For Maria, that was the true reward. Months later, when she returned home to the Philippines for a short break, her story had already reached her hometown. Her neighbors congratulated her, her teachers beamed with pride, and her father met her at the bus station with tears in his eyes. He didn't need to say much. He simply held her close and whispered, "Anak, you carried us with you." That night, sitting once again at the same table where she had stumbled over words as a child, Maria reflected on her journey. She realized that the laughter she once feared had lost its power. She realized that her accent, once a source of insecurity, was now her badge of identity. And most of all, she realized that the story was no longer about her alone. It was about every Filipino who dared to speak, who dared to be heard. So what is the lesson in all this? Perhaps it is simple, but profound. Never let anyone convince you that your voice is small. Never let laughter silence you. Because the world does not need perfect accents. It needs authentic voices. And the Filipino voice, shaped by history, faith, and resilience, is among the most powerful the world could ever hear. Maria's journey is a reminder to every Filipino watching this now. You are not defined by the way others hear you. You are defined by the truth you carry, the courage with which you speak, and the heart that beats behind your words. And to those who laughed, who mocked, who believed Filipinos could not rise on the strength of their English, the answer has already been given, not through anger, not through retaliation, but through dignity, through grace, and through victory. So the next time someone doubts your voice, remember Maria. Remember the debate. Remember that the same laughter that tried to belittle her became the silence that honored her. And perhaps ask yourself this: what if every Filipino chose to rise above the laughter, to speak with courage, to refuse to be silenced? The world would not just listen, it would change. Because in the end, it is not the laughter that lasts. It is the voice that dares to speak truth. And in that truth, the Filipino voice will always be heard. If this story made you proud to be Filipino, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video, let the world hear our voice, and subscribe for more stories that honor the strength of our people.